I recently gave a talk about my PhD, which was about personality traits. Characteristics that people have, what makes you, you. At the end of the talk, I was asked a question, and the question was, are these traits, what makes you, you, are your characteristics best explained by nature, genetics, or by environment, nurture? This is the nature-nurture debate, whether people's characteristics and their outcomes are explained mostly by genes or mostly by environment. And I gave what I considered to be a reasonable answer at the time, but then I thought more about it. And then I went through all of my notes from the study of genetics in psychology, and having reviewed different studies, I've come to the conclusion that I couldn't answer the question because the question cannot be answered. I believe that question, are your traits and outcomes explained mostly by genes or mostly by environment, more one or the other? The nature-nurture debate is unsolvable. And in this video, I'm going to explain why. If you look below the video into the description, you'll also see references for different academic papers, which you can read if you're more interested in the subject. The first thing you might want to ask is, what causes people's characteristics? Well, the causes of people's characteristics and their outcomes, in psychology, you can really split it into genes and environment. By genes, what I mean is the physical DNA, the genetic material and information that you get from your parents. It's inherited, you get it from your parents. And you still would have got it from your parents, even if you'd never met them. And then there's environment. Environment is just everything else, everything that isn't genes. It includes your social environment, it includes the economic environment, it includes the neonatal environment when you were in the womb. So everything is just genes or not genes, which is environment. So that's exhaustive, it's genes and everything else. Well, how do you know if genes have an impact? How do you know if genes actually affect people's traits and outcomes? And I'm going to tell you about the number, the statistic which is used to measure this, which is called H squared, which is heritability. Heritability is defined as the proportion, the percentage of the proportion of why people differ in some trait, some outcome, which is explained by genes. So it's a proportion, it's a percentage. So if I say that extroversion, for example, has a heritability of 50%, what it means is that people differ in extroversion, and that 50% of the reason why people differ in extroversion is explainable by genetic influence. One way to measure this is in a twin study. Basically what you're doing in a twin study is you're looking at a lot of identical twins, and then you're seeing if the identical twins are more similar to each other compared to non-identical twins. Because remember, identical twins are more closely related to each other than non-identical twins. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, non-identical twins share 50% of their genes. If identical twins are more similar to each other, are more similar compared to non-identical twins, you can use that and then you can calculate the heritability statistic. I'm not going to go through the equation, but I will put it in the description just in case you're interested. So you can do this with twin studies, with adoption studies, and also family studies. And there was a big review of this in 2015, Plomin et al. 2015, and the summary is, and we can see this in the pie chart, why do people differ in characteristics? And this includes psychological traits. Well, around 50% of the reason why people differ in traits is because of genes. 50% genes, and then the rest is environment. And then if you look at the environment, there's a big chunk which is family, that's called shared environment, but then an even bigger chunk which is other environment. As we can see, heritability of 50. So what we're seeing is 50-50. You might look at that and you might say, I see what's going on. The genes and the environment are having the same effect. We've solved the nature-nurture debate. They're both affecting things similarly. But not so fast, because what heritability is doing is it's not saying how much of the trait itself is explained by genes or environment. It's saying how much differences in the trait is explained by it. So if we're looking at someone who is very creative, has an artistic temperament, is always drawing and painting things, a heritability of 50% means that genes explain half of the reasons why people differ in how artistic they are across a large number of people. What it doesn't mean is that the genes explain half of the paintings that this person has made. It doesn't mean that for every environment painting the person makes a gene painting. That's not what it means. And so that by itself doesn't answer the question that we had, are people's outcomes explained more by genes or by environment? So it doesn't really get to the nature-nurture debate. The reason why I think the nature-nurture debate is unsolvable is it's based on the idea, the question itself assumes that there are genes over here and we can measure the effect of genes. And that separately we have environment over here and we can measure the effect of environment. The problem is that just isn't the case. Because genes and environment are always working together, it's impossible to separate them in order to fairly compare them. There are 3 reasons here why the nature-nurture debate can't be solved. Number one, the first reason is because of something called a gene-environment correlation. Gene-environment correlations mean that there are correlations between people's genetic dispositions, your nature, and your environment. The environment isn't just something that happens to you, you actually get to change and shape your environment. So let's imagine there's someone over here who is very creative and artistic and naturally, on account of genetics, is naturally drawing and painting all the time. Well, what can happen is the genes can change the environment, and there are 3 ways that this can happen. First of all, you can have active heritability. So if someone is very artistic, that person might seek out art supplies and go to museums and go to art school, deciding which environment. Second, you can have passive heritability. So if someone is naturally very artistic, maybe it's because their parents were naturally very artistic as well, and maybe that person's parents are setting up an environment which also encourages their child to become artistic. Then also we have what's called an evocative gene-environment correlation. And evocative is where someone's nature, their existing propensities, affect other people in the environment. So if someone is very artistic and is drawing and painting all the time, that person's teacher might take notice of that and think, wait a second, would you like to join the art club? I'll help you apply to art school. So genes are not separate from environment because your environment is affected by your genes, by how other people respond to your genes, and by your parents' genes. The second reason why genes and environment can't be separated is because of something called a gene-environment interaction. So remember we were talking about heritability before. Heritability is the proportion of the reasons why people differ, which is due to genes. And that means that it's the complement of the portion which is explained by environment. So what that means is that the heritability depends on the environment. If one is bigger, by definition, the other one gets smaller. I'll give 2 examples of this. The first is a bit of a silly cliche example. Let's imagine that you have 2 people who were just born in a barrel, same environment, the environment is completely the same. If 2 people are born in exactly the same environment, grow up in exactly the same environment, any difference in their traits or their outcomes must by definition be because of their genes. Because it just can't be explained by the environment. Here's another example. So let's imagine we have this person who's naturally very artistic and creative, and we have another person in the same town. And that other person in the same town is very extroverted, likes to perform. Now let's imagine that this town that they live in is very prosperous, it's got good schools, and it's got a lot of job opportunities. Maybe what happens is that first person in this place with more opportunity goes on to be an artist. That second person then goes on into acting. However, if both of those people are born and raised in an environment with far less opportunity, well, maybe they just both end up in the same place. The environment kind of squashes them down, because if you have an environment which doesn't give you many opportunities, people aren't free to pursue their own interests. And so what that means is that, first of all, genes change your environment, and second, the effect of genes depends on the environment. Thirdly, a third reason why you can't separate genes from environment is because genes are always operating, trying to survive, being selected within an environment. Let's take the example of polar bears. Polar bears have white fur. And if a polar bear has a cub, that cub is going to have white fur. So, having white fur, very clearly inherited, very clearly due to genetics. But then you think, wait a second, why does the polar bear have white fur in the first place? It's because it lives in an environment which is white and full of snow. Having white fur helps you to camouflage, and so the genes were selected by the environment. The environment selected for the genes for white fur, and therefore the existence of the white fur, well, it's because the gene that's inherited, but that's only because of the environment, because they live in the icy tundra. And therefore, you can't actually separate the genes from the environment. And so those are the three reasons why I think the nature-nurture debate is unsolvable, because genes and environment cannot be separated from one another. I think that the nature-nurture debate, asking, are people's characteristics explained more by genes or by environment, I don't think the question can be answered because the question is ill-posed, because it wrongly assumes that genes and environment are separate. The best we can say is that people's traits are explained by genes and also by environment, but it doesn't make any sense to ask which affects your traits more than the other.